Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first chapter, or introduction rather, of the California Laws and Regulations Study Guide, the third edition. This is the material that you need to study for the core exam on many of the licenses: QAL, QAC, pest control aircraft people, agricultural pest control advisor. So this is a lot of the material that will be on those exams. My name is Jace. I'm a practicing QAL qualified applicator licensed here in Mendocino County. I work with a local forestry company doing pest control and weed management. I'm not necessarily an expert in this topic. I was able to pass the QAL, so I do know quite a bit of this material, and currently I'm studying for the Pest Control Advisor license. So I am creating this study guide with hopes that, I'll learn something more along the way, study for the exam at the same time, and try to help out everybody else. There's not a lot of this material online, and I know that many of us who are studying for these licensing tests are working people who just don't necessarily get the time to sit down and read this material. So even if I just help a few people along the way, that's a few people more who have these licenses that can be of use to them in the field. So I hope that you guys get something out of this. And I'm sorry for the walls of text. I pulled all this material straight out of the Laws and Regulations Study Guide. So if you guys want to get more in-depth, although I put much of the material in this, then you can go read that when you get the chance. You'll find the same explanations on there. And a lot of these questions and material that I put in here is based upon the qualified applicator and certificate licensing, the core examination questions. So I pulled the questions from there and I put the information answering those questions into this presentation. So yeah. All right, so the introduction. We're going to get into some of the very core concepts that the introduction focuses on, and we'll work through some of this material and just get some of the basics down. All right, so who's creating these laws and regulations? How is this working? So the first lead regulatory agency, and probably one of the most important ones, is the federal government, of course, nationwide. So the main players are the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and they regulate all aspects of pesticide registration. And they do this under the created laws in the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, and the regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations Title 40, or 40 CFR. I cannot stress how important FIFRA is. This is going to be a lot of the material on the test oftentimes focuses on FIFRA, and this act is one of the most important pieces of legislation in pest control and pesticides. It pretty much governs the entire United States. It's the first line of pesticide regulation, and it ensures that all pesticides are run through, a safety trial and extensive research, which determines whether or not they can be used on the broader scale and given to the states. So this is the first line of defense against harmful pesticides, which may hurt people or may not do what is required of it. So in addition to registering all pesticide products before they are sold, held for sale, or otherwise distributed in commerce reviews, State regulatory programs for compliance with federal requirements include the Federal Worker Protection Standard. So these codes of federal regulations and PFRA are involved in pretty much what I just said. The registering of products which are sold or are going to be sold, in addition to the Federal Worker Protection Standard, which is included in all pesticide labels and governs the use and requirements of use of these pesticides. And from the federal government, they are in charge of regulating various states as well. So they create, a certain federal applicator program and training, which is the broader regulations for what a pesticide applicator must be. And then based upon that information, states can become more regulatory. They can add additional restrictions. And when they do this, the federal government monitors the states and makes sure that their programs, which train applicators, meet their standards. So certification and training, enforcement and compliance, worker health and safety, and environmental monitoring and protection. So all of these are things that the federal government will observe in local states and ensuring that, they're living up to the code that they've laid out. All right, next, the lead regulatory agency for California. So California has many complex laws and regulations covering pesticides and pest control, written to address various concerns over pesticide registration, sale, and use activities in pest control settings unique to California, while also incorporating federal laws and restrictions. So California being like it is, there are a lot of additional laws and regulations placed upon pesticide usage and pest control in general in the state of California. As you can imagine, they are pretty extensive. And so with that, a lot of these laws and regulations are built upon the federal laws and regulations. So these state pesticide use laws are located in the California Food and Agricultural Code, FAC Divisions 6, 7, and 13. I can guarantee that'll be a test question. Now, these laws govern most pesticide use, with the emphasis placed on agricultural pesticide use, although they also cover some structural pest control activities. So they categorize agricultural and non-agricultural pesticide use as kind of in somewhat of a different category than structural pesticide use. And so these laws are passed by the legislature, California legislative branch, and people vote on these pesticide laws. And then that gets passed to the governor, the executory branch, who can either sign these laws into effect or not sign these laws into effect. And once these laws are passed, there are regulations which are located in Title III California Code of Regulations, or 3 CCR, Division 6. And for these regulations, the Department of Pesticide Regulation is responsible for writing and implementing regulations that carry out the requirements of the law. So these laws get passed, and once the governor signs it into effect, it gets passed on to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And then the DPR has to figure out, okay, based upon these laws, what are we going to do here in order to uphold them and make sure that people who are using these pesticides and restricted materials are taking these laws into account and following them. And then additionally, after the state level, you have counties and local governments, and the main person who monitors this stuff is the County Agricultural Commissioner, or CAC. Now, they have the limited authority to propose additional county-specific regulations and can apply them to their county. And so these county-specific regulations supplement the regulations in 3 CCR to local, and I can't see it because this thing is blocking it, but additional requirements on individuals and businesses involved in the sale, possession of pesticides. So the County Agricultural Commissioner is in charge of looking at things on a local level and saying, how should these laws and regulations apply to my county, and how can I make them better suited? So they have the option of trying to impose additional regulations on top of what California has passed. And usually these regulations, or almost always these regulations, have to be approved by the DPR. You can't have a county agricultural commissioner who's like, we got to ban all pesticides. That's not going to work. The DPR has to approve these and ensure that the county agricultural commissioner is doing their job in imposing reasonable regulations. I just realized halfway through that the camera was on. That's why I couldn't see on that last slide. I've turned that off now. And I'm too lazy to re-record all that, so I know now going forward. So, why do all these laws and regulations exist, and what is their purpose? Okay, and this is pulled straight from the text. So, the purposes of pesticide and pest control laws and regulations, as according to the California Food and Agricultural Code and Regulations in Title III of the CCR, California Code of Regulations, are to 1. Provide for the proper, safe, and effective use of pesticides used in the production of food and fiber, and the protection of public health and safety. So, making sure that these pesticide laws and regulations are not only safe and effective, but also look out for the public, pretty straightforward. That's probably the most important one. After, of course, you could argue before. Protecting the environment from environmentally harmful pesticides by prohibiting, regulating, or controlling their uses. So we'll talk about this later on. This is a lot of like the groundwater protection areas, making sure that these pesticides aren't running into flowing bodies of water. They're not going into the water supply. They're not killing off local fauna and flora. You want to make sure that these pesticides aren't just destroying the environment, which is what you'll see in the past with organophosphates and carbamates, which have caused a lot of issues in people, cancer and neurotoxins, whatnot. It's killed, various creatures. So, number 2, protecting the environment, and very important, equal to number 1 probably. Number 3, assure that agricultural and pest control workers have safe working conditions where pesticides are present. So just like the Federal Worker Protection Act or whatever in the labels, these laws are in addition to those in order to make sure that any pest control workers who are using these pesticides are not, getting sprayed in the face with some extremely toxic, pesticide. They're just making sure that they have safe working conditions for them to exist in. Number 4, authorize pest control and make sure that it is done by competent, responsible licensees and permittees under strict control of the Department of Pesticide Regulation and the County Agricultural Commissioner. So this is where you're going to get into a lot of the licensing and certification, which we'll talk about later, but they just want to make sure that these people who are using any of these pesticides have the necessary training and knowledge in order to use them, so that you're not having a bunch of people who are, going around spraying things that they don't necessarily know the full effects of or how to mitigate those effects. And number 5, assure applicators, consumers, and other users that the pesticide they use are properly labeled and are appropriate for the uses designated on the labeling. Yep, so just making sure these products, have the necessary information on them to ensure their proper usage. And number 6, encourage the development and implementation of integrated pest management systems, stressing the integration of biological and cultural pest control techniques with the use of selected pesticides when these are necessary to achieve acceptable levels of control with the least possible harm to non-target organisms in the environment. So a lot of that information on integrated pest management you'll find in the core exam for the PCA, the book IPM in Practice, that gives a lot of information on that. And then QAL book, pesticides, safe and effective use of pesticides, talks about it too. So pretty much what they're saying is, they want to make sure that pesticides aren't just the go-to. That every single time you have a pest problem, you're not, okay, let's dump a bunch of pesticides on it and just use that only. They want to see that you're trying to think of other ways that you can reduce these pest levels and have an effective reduction of them if it's feasible financially. So, they don't want you spending an extra 200% finances trying to do something that might not do the same effectiveness as pesticides. But if you're able to integrate pesticides with some other control method, such as, biological control, like introducing ladybugs into a field with aphids or something along those lines, you can increase the effectiveness of these pesticides and reduce the usage of these pesticides later on. All right, so who is California's state lead agency? Responsible for creating the statewide pesticide regulatory program. So the main agency is the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, or DPR, as you'll hear it abbreviated. The DPR is the state lead agency. They're the main ones involved in developing and implementing the regulatory programs, which are based on the 3CCR and FAC, the laws which are passed by legislation approved by the governor. They're the ones that are putting it into effect. So they regulate all aspects of pesticide sales and use to protect public health and the environment from known adverse effects that might occur from the legal use of pesticides. They also conduct certification and licensing of individuals and businesses that work in agricultural and non-agricultural pesticide and pest control industries with the enforcement of all pesticide use laws and regulations. So DPR is probably the most important agency for pest control users in the state of California. You got to report all your pesticide use to them. You got to make sure that they know what you're doing. Well, first it goes to the CAC and then up to the DPR. But both of them work together in order to make sure that you're using these pesticides safely and effectively without cutting corners, without spraying things where it can't or shouldn't be sprayed. So probably the most important regulatory agency minus the US EPA on the broader scale. However, the DPR doesn't do everything by themselves. They do have cooperating agencies that help them out. Some of these agencies, like county agricultural commissioners, which is what we've been talking about, each county has its own county agricultural commissioner involved in local regulations and enforcement of pesticide use laws in agricultural, residential, non-agricultural, and structural pest control. So they're the ones making sure everything's done according to what the DPR wants with any additional restrictions placed on it. And then the University of California State Integrated Pest Management Program, the UCIPM. So a lot of the material that you'll find for studying for this test and for any guides or things that you may have questions on, UCIPM usually has created something for you to look at and read and gain information. They do tests and research, they create study guides, they give you pretty much all the information you need to be a good IPM practicer and pest control person. Next, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA, ensures the state's food safety, protects the state's agricultural from invasive species, and promotes the California agricultural industry. So CDFA is those people who stop you every time you enter the state that you think are annoying. They're looking for potential invasive pests, which may be hitching a ride on grandma's plant you brought back from New York or something. Who knows? But they're the ones that are stopping you, looking for anything that they can see. They ensure the state's food safety, so they're the ones going out there and testing batches of various agricultural products, making sure you're not spraying over the maximum residue of pesticide that you're allowed to spray, or spraying pesticides that don't belong on that specific crop. And they promote California agricultural as an industry, so, you know, commercials and all that jazz. And the Structural Pest Control Board. So they certify structural pest control applicators. License is structural pest control applicators and businesses, and conducts field enforcement of structural pest control laws and regulations. So when you're tenting a house and filling it full of fumigants, they're the ones that might stop by and make sure that you're doing things correctly and that nobody's dead inside. Next, California Department of Public Health certifies vector control pesticide applicators employed by a government vector control agency and develops vector control pest control study guides. So this is a different version of a pesticide applicator. I'm not entirely familiar with it. I think it has to do with like the applicators that are ensuring public health and safety in hospitals and settings like that, where they're working with chemicals that, you know, disinfect and clean things, and ensuring that people are safe in the treatment of various diseases. All right, so what does it take to become a licensed or certified pesticide applicator? So this is relevant information for anyone studying to take the test and get a specific license or certificate. So the how. Applicants must pass a core examination and pass at least one pest control category examination. So for me, when I took the QAL, I passed the core examination, and then I took the forestry examination for the category because I worked in the field of forestry. So I needed that license, that specific category, in order to do what I'm doing right now. What are the certificates and licenses? So these are the available positions that you can get a certificate or a license for. So the Qualified Applicator Certificate, the Qualified Applicator License, the Pest Control Aircraft Pilot Certificate, and the Agricultural Pest Control Advisor. And we'll go more into detail in another chapter which covers all of this relevant information. So the core examination. The core examination requires individuals to demonstrate a minimum standard of knowledge and competency related to pesticides and pesticide use and sale. So a lot of the material for that core examination is in what we're talking about right now, the laws and regulations. They want to make sure that you understand the laws and regulations behind pesticide use, because it's probably the most fundamental thing outside of knowing how to use them, knowing when to use them. So how is the County Agricultural Commissioner involved in these certifications? They certify private pesticide applicators and conduct local enforcement of pesticide use laws and regulations in agricultural, residential, non-ag, and structural pest control settings. So they're making sure that the people who are applying these in their local level are certified individuals that know what they're doing. And they also administer the examination and issues the specific certificate to those who register in that county. Next, federally restricted pesticides and their use. So the US EPA requires states to certify individuals who are private or commercial pesticide applicators who use or supervise the use of federal restricted pesticides. So for federally restricted pesticides, we'll talk more about that next chapter. But pretty much these pesticides have additional regulations placed upon them for specific reasons. And so in order to use these pesticides, you have to have an extra level of training and knowledge about their use. So when you're using these, you need to be certified applicator, which is where the federal regulatory program and certification programs come into play on enforcing it on the state level and the federal level. And so California has another version of restricted materials, and generally the DPR requires that individuals possess applicator certification when using or supervising the use of California restricted materials, which includes federally restricted use pesticides and other pesticides that they have deemed to require that restricted material application, So the DPR has placed all federally restricted pesticides under the restricted materials and other pesticides that California has deemed to be requiring additional training on for various reasons. They think that it may cause additional harm and so on. So when you're supervising this, you got to be aware of the conditions and the use site and the ability to exercise control over a non-certified applicator. So oftentimes a certified applicator is in control of many other applicators, and they're the ones that tell them what to do, tell them when to stop, tell them, whatever they need to know in order to effectively and safely apply these pesticides. So it's a huge responsibility, especially when you're working with these restricted materials.